Welcome to the Hate Meditations podcast. It's May the Force Day be with you, or as we say in the UK, Force may be with you. Um, we've got the band back together. Today we're discussing the role and purpose of music criticism and what makes good music writing, and is it still valuable? Does it still serve a purpose in, today's age of instant access and so on? And I promise to do my utmost to set aside any bias that I may have in this regard, given how many hours I throw into writing about music in my spare time when I should be hugging my son. I'm joined once again by the incomparable Joseph April. Good to have you back on.
Thank you, Shelley. Hi, everyone.
Hello. And the one and only my Spanish counterpart, Belisario. Thank you very much for joining.
Hi, happy to be here.
And happy to have you on. And I'm also thrilled to say we are joined by Mr. Daniel Lake of Decibel magazine and author of USBM, A Revolution of Identity in American Black Metal. Thank you very much for joining today, Mr. Lake. I'm really excited to see your contributions on this.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited to hear from a bunch of different perspectives on this stuff.
Yeah, I think we will. All four of us sort of have slightly different views on the topic today in terms of music writing, music criticism, writing reviews, and so on, because we tend to sort of approach things from a slightly different angle, I think, and from different levels. I will say from the outset, though, that I have been plagued by a combination of migraines, fevers, and diarrhea, which I'm sure you wanted to know. So you may not be getting my best work out of this episode, but I will do my utmost to remain conscious. So I'll start, I guess, by just throwing a question out there, which is, if you're a music critic, what qualities makes a good music critic, I should say? Do they need to be well versed in music theory? Do they need to play an instrument themselves, or is it just enough to be familiar with what they're writing about? And equally on the writing side, what skills makes a good music writer? Because, someone could be deeply intimate with a form of music, someone could know everything about it, but maybe not be that talented as a writer. Do you have any views on what makes a good music critic, essentially? I'll just throw that one out there for now.
I'm happy to jump in. I can say that from my perspective, I think one of the most important aspects of any, music criticism is, a person's ability to write. When I'm reading somebody else's perspective, I have to be engaged. I have to enjoy what I'm reading. Now, the person also has to be well enough versed in what they're writing about for me to be convinced by their points of view. But I would say that first and foremost, I need to be engaged, and that writing needs to be good, needs to be on point, and to a certain level, entertaining, for whatever that word means. Like, I guess engaged is maybe my preferred term. I don't need to be entertained, but I do need to be engaged. I do need to be invited in and feel like I'm really getting something interesting from that writing.
Yeah, I suppose that's an interesting point, is the difference between entertaining writing and engaging writing, because entertaining writing could just be sort of anything that you could sort of say is creative writing, in a sense, whether it's sort of writing an essay or if it's just snappy kind of prose, then that can be entertaining. But with a music review, you do kind of want it to have some insights, or say something that at least gets you thinking about the music. And I'm thinking about this in terms of, I was recently sent a mixtape by a friend of mine who is not a metal guy at all, and I posted, if any of you read Hate Meditations, you might have come across it, but I posted my review of it, where the tape was essentially a lot of jazz, funk, and soul, and things that are basically well outside my oeuvre, and I have sort of very little frame of reference for it. And it was a real challenge to write a review in the same way that I would write a metal review in that regard. And it was kind of a wake up of like, oh yeah, this is actually really difficult to write in an engaging way that sort of treats the music on its own terms, but also doesn't make me seem completely ignorant, even though I am, where I'm trying not to say anything that's going to really piss off a fan of that kind of music. And one of the things I always gives me pause when I'm reading an album review is if someone says I'm not familiar with this artist, but blah blah blah. It's like I'll normally give them a bit of grace and think, well, they're still entitled to write about the artist, but I would prefer it if they knew, especially if it's an older band, I would prefer it if they knew something about them and where the album might sit in their evolution and so on. It's kind of that balance of a degree of intimacy with actually engaging with the material in a way that communicates to the reader. Cool. Okay. So I guess we'll touch on what I kind of mentioned in the introduction around music criticism and its purpose now. Back in the day when, you had to buy music and, your money might be limited and you making the choice of the monthly purchase meant that you wanted, to spend it on something that you thought was worthwhile. So picking up a magazine with some reviews in, or even an underground zine might have been the way to do that. And you kind of writers form a sort of bond of trust with an audience or whatever, and you kind of think, well, I know that journalist and they always have pretty good taste, so I'll pick up what they're saying. Whereas now you can just you can pretty much pick up anything straight away without the need to worry about that. But I still feel like music criticism still serves a purpose. If you found an album that you like and you want to maybe dig deeper into the artist, maybe get someone else's perspective on who they are, where they sit in context and so on, I think it can be useful. But equally, there is a danger that it kind of will influence your view of the music to some extent, and you're not hearing it with your own ears, but you're kind of hearing it through the filter of someone else's opinions on that. Do you have any views on like the role of music criticism in, the age of like instant access, I suppose?
Well, I think we have to agree that the climate that we're in right now, the situation we find ourselves in, is completely different from the 80s, the 90s. You do not have to go purchase something in order to hear it. So you do not need to rely on people to tell you what to purchase. That said, I would agree with you, Shelley, that there's a conversation to be had about music. In fact, I enjoy feeling like there's a community that I'm participating in when I write. I'm giving my perspective, but knowing that a dozen other people are writing their perspective, that conversation, even though it's not happening at the same website, in the same place, it allows for people to go out and engage with the music, with other people's perspectives on the music. It generates conversation. I enjoy that back and forth. I enjoy being able to see music and its different facets from different people's perspectives. So I definitely think that writing about this stuff, that music criticism being available, is super useful.
Yeah, it's interesting that, because as you were saying that, it suddenly occurred to me that although I write a lot about music, I don't read as much. I don't read as many other writers on metal as you'd think. If there's a particular album where I think, no, I do want to sort of know how this is kind of being received by the scene, then I will sort of try and trawl through reviews from various different publications or whatever. But in general, I try to approach an album like cold, as it were, and then I very rarely kind of seek out other people's opinion on it. And again, I think that's partially down to the fact that I need to sort of find the writing engaging enough to want to read it to some extent. I don't know, Joseph. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, Dan and I have talked about this quite a bit, but I mean, I definitely think we are in a different realm especially compared to the glory days of heavy metal in the 80s and 90s and even early 2000s, where there was a certain level of gatekeeping in terms of the criticism. And I, developed as a metalhead in the early 2000s, where there was still a bit of a barrier to music. I didn't have super fast internet speed, and even then, still really freshly being exposed to the music. Yeah, what was mentioned in magazines and even what was being mentioned the early days of blogging had a pretty big impact on me in terms of what people would recommend or what people would say was good or bad, in terms of what they think in context of a particular band. And these days, yeah, I mean, little more usually is needed for me to give something a try than it's a friend or someone mentioning something and saying, oh, it's like this, and I can go check it out, rather than, because there's no, when you only have so much money to go out and buy an album, it's there's risk in your choice. And with risk, you want to rely on someone kind of guiding you in that. But when there's no risk, that guidance just doesn't feel necessary as much. Now, on the other hand, certainly even more than in the early 2000s, there is just such a giant, pile of music to sift through that I suppose there is certainly still utility in having someone kind of guide you through some of it. But it's definitely a very different world. And I kind of relate to you, Shelley, in that I probably rely on it reading other people's opinions and criticism far less than I used to.
Yeah, what I was thinking just then was like, there is still value, yeah, because there's so much music to sift through, and aside from like the artists that you already know you like, sort of knowing where to begin can be a bit overwhelming. It can be useful to have maybe a few publications that are pushing you toward different releases, but then part of me thinks that's sort of like reducing the music critic to what I call consumer advice, in that it's just saying like, check out these 10 albums this month or whatever, and there's not really time to engage with the music on a deeper level. And I've had this sort of internal debate before where I'm like, should I just write about less music but more in depth, or should I still try and cover a broader range of music, for my own benefit, to see where the scene is at right now, and also because I know that some people do read my blog to actually get recommendations. And the other publication I write for, Metal Legion magazine, Portuguese-based magazine, they only release, I think it's once a quarter, an issue. It's not a monthly thing, but there's a good 150, 175 albums, EPs, compilations reviewed in that. And again, it could be I understand that it's a really useful resource. Our editor has kind of said he's quite keen for us to be quite rigorous in terms of how we rate albums and not just hand-waving everything, because our readers do come to us for honest opinions on stuff. We're not just plugging everything and everyone. But at the same time, I'm sort of thinking, well, I'm not just trying to get people to go out and buy things. I am actually trying to engage with the music, maybe not on like a deep philosophical level at the point of reviewing, but it does keep my brain in the scene, as it were, and where it is. And I guess what I'm kind of getting at there is it could be one of the differences between an underground blog that has very little kind of restrictions on what they can and can't do, because it's just some guy with their own blog and they can pretty much write whatever they want, and then a larger publication that has lots of connections with labels and promoters and some of the larger bands and stuff, and there's a bit of give and take. I don't know, Belisario, do you have any thoughts as someone that has an underground blog as to how often you write about music and what you get from it?
Oh, I think that from 20 years ago to the current time, I think we went from one extreme to the other, because 20 years ago we're still doing sometimes blind buying, which was indeed exciting but sometimes a bit disappointing. And now I have so many recommendations and so many people I'm in contact with that recommend me stuff that I don't even need to do a blind listening. So I always have something written down to check, and there is really a surplus of stuff, and so you can say I don't have to look for it. It just comes to me, and I have to sift through it. So it's actually the country that I could do 20 years ago. I don't know if it's worse or better, but it's like this. So the modus operandi is completely different nowadays if you want to review stuff.
Interesting. And what about the? Sorry, go on.
Sorry, I was gonna just jump in and piggyback on what you and you guys had already said. Just that, no, I don't think that anybody needs to be pointed toward a new creator record, or pointed toward a new Abath record. But there's plenty of like really interesting stuff that, with the glut of music releases, is out there and people might not find at all. Also, I would mention that, and this is not straying from the point, this is part of the same point, there's a value not just to the readership, but a value to the artists themselves. If I hear some band playing material that I think is really interesting and really worthwhile, and I want to find a way to serve their cause and get their stuff out there, writing about it and getting other people to notice that exists, if I can help the band at all, that makes me feel like I'm participating in a positive way.
Yeah, that's definitely true, because I think one of the other reasons I do write is because don't really play. Well, I don't play guitar, I play piano, but I don't really play any metal music or anything, and I don't really contribute to the scene in the same way. So it is a way for me to push bands or little scenes that I think are doing something interesting, and then if anyone else picks it up off the back of what I'm doing, then that's absolutely fantastic. Equally, I can find it quite cathartic because, yeah, I totally agree. The bigger bands, it's kind of superfluous writing reviews about them, but I still find it really interesting getting the reaction. Maybe not from someone like Creator, who they're just, they're so well established now and they're going to release Creator albums, and sort of people know what they're getting by this point. But I guess, how far are we in? We are 17 minutes in, and I'm going to mention Blood Incantation. Sorry, everybody. We have different opinions on the quality of that band and their latest album, but one of the things I found really interesting about when that album came out was, for a second, basically the entire death metal scene around the world was talking about one band and one album, and I really found it interesting reading different perspectives on it, both positive and negative, because I was like, that so rarely happens now within death metal, because it's so fractured and diffuse in terms of scenes, and there's a few bands that have risen above the parapet and gained notoriety alongside Blood Incantation, but for the most part, it's sort of very decentralized and everyone's sort of involved in their own little sections of it, and it's very hard for a band to gain that kind of traction within the scene. And that's not just true of death metal, that's true of most sort of metal subgenres and actually well beyond metal as well. But that was one of the times when it's like, yeah, I found the writing on it, even if I didn't agree with what they were saying, just a very interesting kind of exercise to kind of take in, I suppose.
Yeah, and I would suggest that one of the things that has always, that I feel like I've been aware of and concerned about is whenever a publication of any size allows one review to speak for the whole masthead of the publication, it's fine, but I also feel like it's a missed opportunity. That reading different perspectives, as you were saying about Blood Incantation, positive, negative, different approaches to what the music is doing and why it's positive or negative, being able to read all of those things can really inform the listenership of what's various things that are really happening in there, and can really connect to different people's perspectives in different ways. There was a short period of time when Decibel Magazine had a writer named Jonathan Dick and another writer named Chris Dick, and I thought we should run some sort of column called Dueling Dicks, mostly because that's funny. but also the idea of like having two writers coming at the same piece of music and hashing out their own points of view in ways that don't necessarily agree. Because I don't know that I need a publication to, that the entire masthead agrees that this is the correct perspective. I like the idea of differing opinions wrestling toward some broader viewpoint.
That's interesting, that, because actually, Jason and I almost accidentally did exactly that with a album that came out last year by a band called Mephitis, who I think they're a death metal band, but they kind of have black metal elements to them, arguably. But I think they're one of the most interesting bands operating in the underground at the moment. But their latest album, some people found it a little bit disappointing, or it was a bit of a left turn. And I wrote a positive review, but Jason sort of criticized me for, and not entirely unjustifiably, for not really writing about the music, but writing about the context of which they were releasing music. And then he wrote his own review, and he asked if it could be published on Hate Meditations, which I agreed to. And he was basically, the review was not like ripping me to shreds, but it was criticizing my approach. And then a couple of the comments were like, I'm not sure how helpful this is. And then a couple of the other comments were, no, I found this exercise really interesting, because obviously Hate Meditations is very much, it's just me, it's just my opinion, so you're not going to get differing views, although Jason does sometimes write guest entries. But I would definitely agree, for a larger publication where there's lots and lots of different voices involved, like Decibel, it could make for a really interesting way to analyze albums. I remember as well, I can't remember where I read this now, but it was someone was pulling out all of the old reviews from like Kerrang, from like classic 90s black metal albums, and how overwhelmingly negative they were at the time. And it's kind of like, now they've done retrospects on those albums and they've featured the bands themselves, and things have changed. But it was quite amusing to think, yeah, basically at the time, tentpole publications were basically out and out giving these albums a very, very negative response, and then that's just kind of stamped in history now, is like, Kerrang did not like this album. But if they'd sort of taken an approach where other reviewers were allowed to also maybe address those albums, then it doesn't need to be just binary as to what that publication thinks about a certain band or whatever. So I will say, just at this point, we are using notes very kindly provided by Belisario just to kind of guide the discussion a little bit. And we're touching on the differences between mainstream journalism and underground blogging. And you've kind of put here, Belisario, do they just take different paths, or are they openly hostile to each other? I think first off, before we started recording, Dan, you asked what we might mean by mainstream. For me, it's basically anything from sort of Decibel up. So that would include like Metal Hammer and Kerrang in the UK as well. I don't know if, Belisario, you had a different definition in mind.
More or less the same as you. It's a bit difficult to define it in an exact way, but it would be, yes, pretty much everything that has wide distribution or that is printed on paper on different countries, that would be mainstream. And what we do, it would be rather underground, especially my site, which is much smaller than yours.
My site's still basically underground. So in terms of like...
Well, I mean, that poses the interesting thing. Like, we would say maybe mainstream would be something like Metal Sucks or Metal Injection, even though they don't have a print presence.
Yeah, those sites did occur to me as well, because they do... I mean, they do review albums, even though most of their content seems to just be...
clickbait.
Yeah. I have trouble looking at their websites because it's such a cacophony of pop-ups and information, and yeah.
And we can get to it later, but I think tied into this, especially since we're also now discussing the difference between print and blog, one thing I wanted to mention is just how, in the discussion that Dan brought up about like why not have differing views on one single album mentioned or one single band, I think the interesting thing in the era that we're in now is that the mediums have changed and evolved to where now there are avenues where maybe the reason we don't see that so much in print is the fact that it is so much better suited for something like video or audio, such as exactly what we're doing right now.
That's a good point as well.
Though I would ask the question, while it may be better suited, do we see it much in video and audio? Maybe some podcasts are bringing in multiple people to talk about one record. I see a lot of solo videos on things like this.
Yeah, I was going to say the overwhelming majority of YouTube content I come across on metal is normally one guy, or maybe there is a podcast and they might discuss albums, but I wouldn't call them necessarily reviews. But most of the time it's one guy or one gal giving a review of an album or whatever. There's not like, so there's another YouTube channel I follow, not related to music at all. Most of our listeners probably heard of it, Red Letter Media, who mostly cover films. But their review format is the two main guys sit down and discuss the film, and they might have very different opinions on the film, and they just hash it out for half an hour to an hour. And I've always thought I'd like to do that at some point with metal, in terms of if I had any friends that lived in the proximity of where I live, in order to do that, I could have an intelligent conversation about it and set up a camera or whatever. It's always been something I'd want to do, because it would be quite an instructive way of unpacking an album. But equally, I quite like reading reviews so that I can listen to the album as it's playing. I've always sort of steered clear of audio for that reason, I suppose, but that's kind of by the by.
I wonder if, in part, I mean, I think the one thing with that, I enjoy Red Letter Media as well, because that does, it seems like with film criticism, there is, and maybe that goes back to the Roger, Ebert and Siskel and Ebert kind of back and forth format that's been so baked in with film criticism. But I also wonder if that's because in programs like that, there's sort of an allowance for showing like clips and pieces of the material, whereas in the internet ecosystem we live in, especially with things like YouTube and places like that, that these services tend to be very litigious about sampling music that maybe you don't have the copyright of, where it seems like in film and television you can kind of get away, at least with short bits being presented to the audience.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding of it is legally it should fall under fair use because you're criticizing it. But yeah, YouTube is it's a lot of hassle because it will always flag it if there's samples of copyrighted music, and you can fight it. But I understand it's quite a convoluted process, and if you're looking to monetize your videos, it can be quite a long drawn out process.
Because even for again with the different mediums, like not to jump that far ahead, but it's related to this. Probably the biggest person of figure of music criticism in our modern age is Anthony Fantano. I can't think of anyone else who, certainly in the internet, has a bigger footprint. And having I don't watch everything of his. Some of his music I really don't care about, but having watched enough of it, I know he doesn't include any samples of the music ever. It's purely just discussing it. So I think that's, the way the system is set up, it seems that like if even the most prolific figure in that includes not a speck of sharing the actual music being discussed, I think it shows kind of the difficulty of that in this ecosystem.
Yeah, he did used to in the early days, back in like 2010, I think. But yeah, as YouTube grew more litigious, I think he made that decision not to do it because it means that he can't, monetize his videos. But yeah, I definitely agree. He's probably the most high-profile internet music critic, and I guess bringing it back to the discussion of what counts as mainstream, given that he does cover metal quite a lot, I always do watch the reviews that he posts of albums that I might interact with at times. Not necessarily because I'm interested in what he has to say, but because it just gives me a little kind of allows me to take the temperature of what a more mainstream audience might be thinking of this music at a particular time, whether it's an Autopsy album or a Cannibal Corpse album or something, that kind of level that he tends to review. Although he has done things like Absu as well in the past, which has been pretty cool. But I guess this comes back to the possible antagonism between underground blogging and more mainstream opinion writing, in that I guess the underground is much less accountable to an audience. It can be very kind of what I'd call guerrilla content, in that people can be very unfiltered in their opinions. They're not beholden to audience response in the same way, and that can have its downsides, in that it might be the views are a little bit incoherent, and it hasn't gone through the editing process where someone has kind of read it and said not quite sure what you mean there or whatever. But also it allows a certain degree of freedom, but equally it can be like encourage people to be overly negative or a bit vindictive at times, which is something I've been accused of as well. And I guess, is that kind of what you meant by the possible hostility between mainstream and underground, Belisario?
I was thinking more in terms of maybe agenda of the reviewers. Like, for example, with Anthony Fantano, you or I think we're reviewing, we're holding very different music from what he thinks is good. So it's kind of an opposition, maybe not open, but we are talking about different bands and different direction that metal should head to. So I guess it's not only a matter of size of the media, but also that our very idea of metal is quite different, I guess.
Well, in Belisario, it's interesting you point that out. Because I was thinking, as soon as you mentioned that, I was like, well, I don't know, does he really have an agenda? But then I thought about it for a few seconds, and certainly I think there's an agenda, even by the nature of his program, where he clearly wishes to situate metal as being in conversation, as in sort of a piece in the puzzle of wider mainstream music and music in general. I mean, not like, it's metal and then just mainstream. He does a variety of things. So certainly he's in conversation and interest in having metal discussed alongside like a Charlie XCX album or then like a Death Grips album or something like that. Whereas maybe some of the publications or some of the blogs and things we associate or read are very much looking at metal within a metal community, not within any wider context.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I think it's one of the problems I've always had with Anthony Fantano, and it's not anything he's doing wrong in particular. It's more, I find his reviews largely inoffensive. I don't necessarily agree with everything he says, but it's not really. I don't find them abrasive or anything like that. But I do sometimes find it frustrating that his views will be the first that a lot of people encounter on metal, because of the size of his platform and the kind of metal that he pushes his audience towards. This might be overestimating the power that a music critic can have in terms of setting the agenda for a scene, because ultimately people like what they want to like, and we do sometimes overestimate the power that opinion makers can have online, I think. But also, that being said, I do sometimes have misgivings about the power that someone like Anthony Fantano has over a scene that he is effectively not really a part of. He obviously is interested in it and he has some knowledge of it, but he doesn't necessarily have a horse in the race in the same way that we do, to some extent. I don't know if that makes sense, but
sure. I understand the perspective. Certainly people who think of the metal scene and what's being created within it as particularly special, and separates itself from a wider world of music by being various things, and I'm probably not the right person to speak on what those things are, whether it's abrasiveness, a way of weeding out most listeners and only inviting in those people who are most invested in those darker points of view. Though I would say I think it's valuable to have somebody who can connect the dots. It is music, and it does belong in the music world. And as much as any individual style of music might break off and have its own meaning and its own value that is maybe hermetic and separate from other things, people who are picking up instruments and creating sound out of it and using that to say something about who they are or the world that they see around them. I think all of that, it's valuable to be able to put those things in context, the way that Joe was saying, to relate those things. And the fact that it does seem that Fantano can do that with some real knowledge. I would agree, Shelley, that, when I listen to him talk about music, I'm sometimes turned off by the non-specificity of the way he talks about it. I maybe miss some more descriptive qualities, but he does really seem to be engaged in the music that he talks about.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like I said, I don't sense any ill will on his part. I guess, yeah, in terms of placing metal in that context, yeah, absolutely, I agree. It does have value as far as that's concerned. But I guess as you were talking, I was sort of comparing it to the kind of tier at which Hate Meditations is at and other underground blogs, where the reviews are much more detailed and intimate with their subject, but also to some extent that being a degree of really try not to use this word, but I'm going to have to, a degree of gatekeeping to some extent, in that it's not just, oh, check this album out, it's quite cool, these bits sound good, you might like this, blah, blah, blah. It's like not all the time, but it is quite a hardcore, in-depth analysis of the minutiae of a particular album, which, if you're a new fan to metal, you might find that a bit alienating to some extent.
Fair point. I also think that certainly at the level, because I do think while Decibel is a print magazine and has some wider reach is the wrong word, but visibility perhaps, more obvious visibility than some of the more underground blogs, I would say that a publication like Decibel ignores the underground online conversation about metal at its own risk, at its own peril, because I have found incredibly cool stuff that I never saw in Decibel just by, looking at whether it's end of the year lists by various online publications or even like monthly, kind of roundups of like, this is cool, that's cool. So from my perspective, paying attention, like more mainstream, more widely distributed print materials absolutely need to be paying attention to all of the levels of this conversation.
Yeah, I guess it's sort of acknowledging the responsibility of having a larger audience, because you obviously can't cover everything. You need to exclude some stuff because there's just so much being released each month. But at the same time, I guess if you're covering certain debates within metal or, the evolution of a particular scene, I sometimes find there's a lack of nuance, or it kind of takes certain facts at face value without saying, oh, actually, this is a bit of a contested point within the scene and some people might disagree with it. The whole thing around elitism and gatekeeping is kind of a bugbear of mine in that regard, in the sense that I find the debate is sometimes flattened off and simplified in more mainstream publications, or at worst, they're openly antagonistic to the debate itself. Whereas I sometimes wish there was a bit more nuance there. But equally, I think the underground blogosphere overcompensates by having a bunker mentality to some extent, and does kind of, it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. They do play out those elitist or kind of gatekeepery behaviors to overcompensate for what they see as a mainstream that is not sensitive to the nuances of the underground. So it's kind of this open sort of antagonism, I suppose.
Great antagonism in metal. Great.
Well, true.
I say keep it up.
So I guess we have kind of touched on whether it's okay for a critic to have an agenda to some extent, i.e. when an album comes out. Say if I was to review the new Creator album, not that I would, because I don't have too many original thoughts on it, but I would probably make it a review of like the state of thrash and the state of legacy thrash bands than I would about the album itself. That's just because I would be tempted to write it that way and find it more entertaining. And yeah, fine, doesn't really make a difference to Creator and their fan base if I write about it, because it's such a small microcosm. But if I'm doing that with a smaller band that might want a plug from me and a bit of kind of promotion or whatever, and I'm sort of spouting off about opinions that aren't really related to the album that they have released, is that fair to them? Is that my right as a critic to kind of use their album as a platform to vocalize opinions I have? It sounded like Joseph was about to say something, but
Well, I mean, do we want to get into the full? Because we could almost dedicate the whole episode to this, and obviously we could do another one and return to it. But there's the whole issue of, I think, especially in the last 10 years, of critics using their platform for essentially political advocacy, and how that has become very much something that's been debated in the scene.
Yeah, I didn't think you were going to say that, but now you say it, it sounds really obvious. In terms of, I don't really want to pick on sites, but Astral Noise, I don't know if it's that big in the US, but it's kind of a mid-size online.
I'm familiar with them.
You're familiar with them, yeah. But yeah, it's like a mid-sized blog, much bigger than Hate Meditations, but not like, I wouldn't call it overground by any stretch. But yeah, it's very explicit in being a left-wing publication. And like, I don't look at it all that often, but yeah, it is. Most of their coverage is coloured by that political lens, which, regular listeners and viewers of my YouTube channel will know that I do have a strong view on politics, but I'm also quite critical of how that view interacts with the metal scene at large. And not critical, but I have a lot of thoughts on how those two should play out, and I try not to let politics kind of get involved in how I'm covering metal from the day-to-day reviews, at least anyway. But yeah, I guess it kind of, in that sense, it would limit or color your audience, because I don't think any of the more traditional hardcore underground black metal fans would go to a site like Astral Noise for anything. But I don't think the creators of that site, that's kind of, I think they would be quite proud of that fact. But
to veer slightly away from the political side of things, though a person's politics certainly plays into what I'm about to say, I have for a long time felt that the concept of objective art criticism is total bullshit. That every person has their own experiences, their own worldview, their own way of entering the world and experiencing what's around them. That creates biases, that creates perspectives, if not maybe an outright agenda. And so because of that, I think every person who's experiencing art and then writing about it has a slant, has some sort of biases. And as long as that person is open about what those biases are, first of all, I guess there are two levels to that. First of all, it's being capable of understanding your own biases, which I suppose is maybe the hardest thing to do, is to notice what you are coming to this art with, and then being open with the audience about those biases. As long as that's happening, that honesty allows for people who share who share those views or have contrasting views to put the opinions in a context, and that's all fair. That's all appropriate.
Yeah, I guess that's why my site's tagline is armchair rhetoric on extreme metal, because I want to make it very clear that it is basically my opinion, and people are very much entitled to disagree with that. But Belisario, do you have any thoughts on that?
I do agree that objectivity is a difficult word to use, but it may be understood, like Dan said, as a kind of honesty, like saying what one perceives in the music and what is one's own position, but then describing music in the best way one can, so that other people can make their own ideas, and be clear on what is description and what is opinion, and leave that to the public so they can judge. And I think one of the coolest things about well-written musical criticism is that people may read your review, which is basically negative, but then get the impression that they might like it because it suits better their taste, and actually get to the music and enjoy it, when in fact the initial source was negative.
Yeah, I've had that happen to me before as well, where I've given a very negative review and someone's commented saying, "Oh, I'm really interested to listen to this now." I'll just be like, I've utterly failed as a critic when that happens.
But you made them happy, so that's good also.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
Although, Belisario, I would say I love what you said there, and I would even say that sometimes when I am tearing into an album that I think is awful, that I hate it, I will actually try to write that review in such a way, as highly negative as I get. The attempt is almost specifically to get people to listen to it, to see why I thought it was that terrible. I'm almost pushing people in that direction. I'm trying to tie that together, like this idea that, yes, when I celebrate a piece of music, I'm trying to get people to listen to it, but almost equally, when I think something's terrible, I think, go check it out and decide for yourself. Here's where I'm coming from, but hopefully these words are so over the top for you that you almost can't avoid trying it out for yourself.
I think one thing I would mention with the idea of, subjectivity and objectivism, and I don't mean Ayn Rand, but I think when we look at something like artistic journalism and artistic criticism, I think when we feel like someone is trying to be quote unquote objective, often what we're really noticing is someone, as Dan well mentioned, being very aware of their own biases, and open to the fact that their readers or listeners are coming with their own biases, and to make a point that to enjoy or to be critical of a piece of art, you don't necessarily need to share maybe all of my biases or my views on politics or philosophy, that we could find some sort of common ground that kind of threads through all these differences. And I think when we notice that, we maybe would say this critic or reviewer or journalist is being a bit more objective, versus someone who would maybe in their work really drive home a point that the greatness of something artistic is because it is only can be interpreted in a very specific way, or that it's or criticizing it because you can't see it be interpreted in any way other than just one way that you find to be negative or against your own personal values.
Naming no names there. No, I have mixed views on this, because I find the idea that yeah, objectivity is impossible, so just kind of make your agenda quite explicit, and then hopefully the reader will begin to trust you, even if they disagree with you, and you'll get some semblance of objectivity through that. I have a lot of sympathy with that view, but equally, as Belisario kind of alluded to, there's a skill to doing that in a way, in that you have to make clear when you're just describing the music, and then you're actually offering your own judgment on it. Because the it's almost trivial to say it, but if a reviewer is saying, in my opinion, X, Y, Z, you don't really need to say that in a review. But equally, I want there are kind of there are hierarchies of opinions. There's your gut reaction. I don't like something, and I don't really want to interrogate why. And then there's a more considered kind of explanation, and maybe one that is, acknowledges your own inbuilt prejudices, whether they be musical or maybe more social or whatever. And then I think there's a higher tier than that where you're trying to sort of tie those various things together and locate the music in the history of the particular genre, and trying to explain why maybe they haven't understood it in a way that comparable bands have. Not to say that you're the arbiter of that to some extent, even though you're kind of pretending to be as you write. But yeah, I'm just sort of trying to figure out how to tie that together, but sort of a aspiring objectivity, I suppose. But
No, that's really, I like the different levels there that you talked about. I think that anyone who is writing and publishing at the gut reaction level is not putting enough time into it. Like a gut reaction is not good enough to publish. The second level where well, now I've lost what you said there. That middle level where it's trying to dig into what you like or dislike about it. That's the appropriate level, I think, for a piece of criticism that is contemporary to the release. And then I feel like you can only get to that third level where you're really tying it into a greater context. That can only happen probably some years after the release and other things have filled in around it.
yeah, one of the things I have started to do actually on separate kind of posts that I write is picking albums that aren't classics but came out maybe 2 or 3, 4 years ago, albums that I reviewed at the time, and then just revisiting them to see if I still agree with my review, updating my opinions, because I think, okay, that's not an enormous amount of time, but it's enough that it's kind of bedded in a little bit. And I don't think enough people do that, especially with the culture of album of the year lists and so on, where most of them tend to be forgotten by the following year. I think it's worth picking out recent releases of the recent past that, at the time you definitely did find very appealing, and kind of relocating them to some extent, and then updating your opinions in that way. And yeah, you're right in terms of you could only really do the top tier that I was kind of trying to flesh out just then with albums that have been knocking around the zeitgeist for some years, and kind of their status is a bit more established. As one of my least favorite things when I'm posting a review onto Metal Archives or something is doing the percentage, because I would very rarely give a new album anything above 90 or even 90%, just because I feel like that's sort of, I need to get to know an album for quite a few years before I'm willing to go that high in terms of my rating. What's one thing we haven't discussed as well is kind of percentage ratings, star ratings, out of 10 ratings and stuff. They're obviously useful if you're just scanning through a list of reviews and you want to know, just, get a sense of where the albums sit. But at the same time, I don't like boiling down my opinions to statistics in that way. But that's just an aside anyway.
That's why I have occasionally enjoyed giving scores in decibel. One album I scored with just a quarter rest music notation. Another album I scored with pi. the number pi, and another album I scored with an eggplant emoji.
But just to fuck with people.
out of 10, of course.
On that, I've noticed that Banger TV, sometimes when they do the reviews, they'll kind of have fun with it by, like, I think the default is out of 5 skulls, but then, like, they'll switch it up where it's like, if it were the band Freeways, who usually has, like, this RV on the cover, it'll be like 3.5 RVs for the new Freeway album.
Banger TV are another one. I forgot about them.
I read somewhere that wine reviewers, and now that I say this, talking about, like, I'm not into wines, so I'm really not sure where I would have picked this up. But I read somewhere that like wine magazines would do reviews of wines, but they couldn't seem to get real engagement with that section of the magazine until they started including a number system. And upon establishing a number system for their ratings of wines, all of a sudden there was much more engagement. I don't know if that says terrible things about the shallowness of people, or if those numbers can somehow grab people. They make a statement, kind of an immediate statement, that then people will, like, dig deeper into the writing.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, actually, because when I'm scanning reviews, even on Metal Archives, where it's got the percentage rating or whatever, but I still find it frustrating that I have to get 3 paragraphs in before the guy gives an opinion on the album. They're just giving history and exposition or whatever, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And if it's well written, then it can be really useful. But if I'm going in to read a review of an album to get someone's opinion on it, I am just instinctively frustrated that you have to get quite far in. And I suppose, yeah, just giving the numbers rating is kind of a shorthand way of doing that. But it's a double-edged sword, because it does remove the nuance from someone's opinion. If they think an album's good, but they want to caveat it with a few things, a numbers rating can sometimes detract from that to some extent.
And what about the, again, like, in terms of media criticism, there's also the other format, obviously most widely associated with Siskel and Ebert, but the whole, rather than a number value, just doing the thumbs up, thumbs down.
Just a binary, good, bad.
Yeah. Well, of course, and then you have the interesting aspect of that, of you do get those mixed ones where one critic is yes, one critic is no.
Yeah, I mean, they kind of do that on Red Letter Media, where at the end they just say, would you recommend this film? And that's kind of
true.
Yeah.
Though I would suggest that you're right, that the numbers do kind of flatten the descriptive perspective on things. But I would say that there are gradations in a number system that do allow for some nuance of opinion. I've always liked this idea that a 6 out of 10 is in some way communicating that if you are already a fan of this band's music, if you are already invested in this stuff, then yes, you should hear this. This is not a thumbs up or a thumbs down. It is, if you're predisposed to this stuff, then 6 out of 10 says go for it. And if this is not your thing already, a 6 out of 10 says it's probably not going to bring you into the fold. So I do kind of like that gradation.
Yeah, it's interesting, actually, now you say that. Because you'd think that would be 5, but 5, even though it's halfway, it seems quite negative score to give something. But yeah, 6 is just enough to plug the album for people that are already predisposed to it.
As anyone working in education knows, it's the difference between a fail or a D.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. Belisari, do you have any thoughts on the numbers rating before we move on?
Yeah, I never know what to do with those. When I post something on Metal Archives, I have no idea, because I don't work with that on my site, and I don't think it tells anything useful for people. So I never know. Usually I write about stuff I like, so I give high rating, but just because I don't know what to do. And to continue with the similitude with the wine system, as far as I know, because I'm a wine buyer, and it has to do mostly with advertising. Like if some wine is taking 90 something from any people giving points, then they're going to put that on every bottle, on every advertise, and usually their sales multiply by 4. So it's a bit like when you see some bigger band releasing something, they have on their press material, they have a list of all the sites that give them 10 out of 10, and it also doesn't tell you anything about the album itself, I think.
Yeah, that's true, actually. One thing I do find frustrating is people that have, on Metal Archives, have what I call 100% incontinence, in that they'll just give any sort of new album or demo or whatever that they quite like, they'll just give it 100% straight away. And I'm sort of like, well, hang on. Sort of, I don't think even my favorite album of all time I'd quite rate 100%. But also, yeah, I think that's one thing people find quite frustrating about my reviews. Even if they're positive, they're not easily clippable, and you can't really put a quote on Bandcamp out of context. Or you can, but it's just a bit more challenging for some people anyway.
It's interesting with the wine scale, because obviously the art of making wine, but it's a very different kind of product, and a very product already, kind of defining it in a other way. But we were talking about, like, what is the point of criticism in an age of music streaming? And it doesn't even have to be streaming that you pay for. I mean, you can just go on YouTube and you can find most music these days. But certainly it's interesting how, like, with wine, you can't really do that, because, like, with music, usually you can hear a song and maybe not even all of a song, and someone can usually kind of make up their mind if they think they might like this or not. Now, it depends. Did you just listen to the intro track? Did you listen to something that really kind of encompasses what the band is doing? And that's not necessarily something that transplants itself to other mediums. Like film and television, no one really wants, other than a trailer, I suppose, no one's like, oh, let me watch 3 minutes of this movie and see if I'll like it. Like, there's sort of a sense that, like, if you've bought into it, whether a review helped you take interest in it, or any promotion or marketing, you kind of feel like you have to sit down and watch it to the very end to decide if you really enjoyed it or not. Whereas in music, that's not really the case. And as well with something like wine, there's that value in, like, oh, this is an 8 out of 10 wine or a 10 out of 10 wine. And it's not like you can go, oh, okay, well, let me get a little sample of it and see what it's like. Unless you're at the winery itself, you can't really do that when you're just looking at through the store. So there's multiple levels of both utility in what's happening with the criticism, but also just how, because of the different form of art, the listener or the one taking in the art can approach it in very different ways.
Yeah, I suppose it's something specific to music, especially a form of music that you know really well. And I guess this comes back to my point around familiarity, is like, I don't play guitar, I don't play drums or anything, but I've listened to enough metal that I can listen to maybe 20 seconds of a promo and know, not necessarily that it's good or bad, but I can instantly place it within a particular subgenre or a particular tradition, and I can kind of gather what their approach is going to be, unless it's a very, very left field release that is doing something very, very different. But I suppose, I mean, I don't really want to talk about wine, because that is definitely an area where I'm not very knowledgeable. But I suppose with a film, there's more chances that they're going to subvert expectations in ways that you can't tell from the first 3 minutes.
Well, yeah, like a film is almost like the direct parallel would be like every album you listen to is a concept album. Like,
yeah.
You have to stick through with it to the end to know whether you thought it was good or not.
But I would say I worry pretty constantly with stuff that I want to check out, but then I only do check out the first song or two. I worry that I am missing all the stuff that's happening later. Because look, some of my favorite albums, they start with a volley of 3, 4, 5 songs, kind of within a certain style. But then by the back half of the album, the band has chosen to use that second half to open up into different things, to bring in various different influences, because they're using the first songs as a way of saying, well, this is what you expect us to be, and this is what we'll be for a little while, but then they have more to say. And I always worry that I'm missing the more that they're saying if I don't spend enough time to hear the whole thing.
Yeah, I suppose to some extent it depends on the band and depends on the genre. Because, yeah, I guess that sort of raised the question in my head of how much bands are, you know, tailoring their albums for a particular impact, because, you know, track list order is a big deal when you're putting an album together and thinking about flow of the music, but also how to grab an audience or how to grab critics, and then which songs to release on the promo and everything like that, and which audience you're trying to grab to that extent. And I guess that does kind of lead us on to like sort of the next point, and the point of what we're even doing in writing about music, in terms of the interaction between the artist and the critic to some extent, in that the critic isn't obliged to give your album a good review for the sake of scratching each other's backs, but equally they are obliged to spend time with the work and give it the attention it deserves, even if they have misgivings from the first few tracks or whatever, or they have misgivings about their particular style and so on. Like, for instance, sorry to draw on the Blood Incantation example again, but it's kind of expected of me that I would give that album a bad review before I've even heard it, because it's Blood Incantation, and I don't, I have a specific agenda about who likes them and where they sit in the scene. But obviously that would be incredibly unfair and narrow-minded for me to sort of prejudge the album too much before I've hit play. And I do remember when it came out, I think I listened to it 3 times in a row to try and fully garner what it is they were going for and give it a fair shake. And I should definitely be doing that with, every album that I come across, in terms of, from smaller bands that I'm not very familiar with at all, to bands where I already have a preconception of who they are and what they're doing to some extent.
I think you raised that a tricky point there, because it happened to me as a, let's say, small-scale reviewer, that I'm in contact with some bands that I like, and then suddenly they send to you a new album, and you don't like the album. You don't find it awful or anything, but you don't find it really special like the previous one. So it's very difficult to tell them, okay, I'm going to talk a bit about it, but I don't like it so much. I'm sorry, but I cannot write something good, a good review about something I don't find is great. And it's a bit difficult, this.
So I've had this problem before, especially with people that I know, whether it's a band or a record label owner or whatever. And most of the stuff they sent me is good, and they've started to like my material, and then they keep sending me stuff. And I used to have a policy of I will just give an honest opinion no matter what, regardless of whether I know them or not, because I don't think that should affect my opinion on the music. But I've kind of softened on that a little bit to some extent, because, I mean, I guess it comes back to your point on these notes, Belisario, about like, is there any point, in trashing an album that you find irredeemable? But it's happened to me before. There's a label that I'm just an underground Italian label, and I've known the guys for quite a few years now. Their music, they've got sort of a few different projects, and I've really liked all of their stuff. But yeah, they sent me a release. I don't think it was one of their projects. It was something on their label, and it just wasn't for me. I think it was like an 8-bit black metal type thing. And I was like, well, I could write a stink piece on this, because that would be my instinct if I was just sent this from some random source that I didn't know. But I was like, no, I'll just reply to them and say, look, this is not me. I'm not going to write about this. Sorry. And they were very cool about it. They were like, "Yep, totally understand, no worries." And I think that's probably the most the diplomatic way to go, but one that balances your integrity as a reviewer with your need to cultivate contacts, especially in sort of at the underground level.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm only trashing stuff that is really famous. That I don't know. I'm not trashing the person behind it. I'm just trashing the big thing around, and they don't need any advertising, so I can speak freely my mind about it. But usually, when I get mediocre stuff or things I don't like, I just don't write about it. I don't see the point of bashing them in this way.
Yeah, I guess from an underground perspective, if you're trashing a bigger band, it's not really going to affect their record sales or their fan base. It might be an interesting piece of writing. But if you come across like an underground band, it doesn't feel fair just to kind of shit on their dreams for the sake of it.
I would agree. I think it's probably bad to be mean spirited in a negative coverage, though I will cop to having written mean spirited pieces. Though I would say that it can be useful for various reasons, I think, to write some negative review or reviews with a negative cast. I worry that if we're only hyping things that we like, then there's no foil for that. There's no contrast to show where the limits of our perspective on quality lie. So having some sort of balance there is valuable. Even if you don't think being mean-spirited is a good idea, there's a way to talk about music that misses the mark versus music that really energizes us.
You ever written a negative review, Joseph? I'm asking because you probably the most tolerant out of all of us.
I mean, there is music I do not enjoy, but no, like a formal writing, not really. I mean, part of that was certainly where I wrote before. I mean, we had discussions about whether there was a point in writing negative reviews, and we kind of agreed. It just felt like we all could use our time better. It's like one negative review is one less like hyping something you actually do like. And given the fact that we weren't, it wasn't our day jobs, where I think that's another aspect when a critic, that is your profession, I think maybe that allows sort of more of a willingness to be negative. Or if, at least an editor is asking you to do that. But if it's like purely your passion projects, I do think at a certain point you get to where you just feel like, why bother? That's perhaps maybe, if nothing else, silence is just as deafening as negative criticism. But no, to answer your point, no, I haven't really.
No, that's an interesting point because looking at like stats behind it as well, negativity does attract more attention. I mean, it's not a particularly original point, but we know this about the way the internet works in general anyway. And if you do write, quite a cutting takedown of a particular album or whatever, it does attract more attention, but it's not the good kind of attention in that, you kind of get a reputation for being a certain kind of critic. Sorry, go on.
No, to that point, there's, not to call anyone out, there is a channel on YouTube that does, they fully admitted this to game the system, but when reviewing an album or doing a piece about a band, they will tag it and kind of do the title as sort of a kind of clickbait kind of thing of like, has so-and-so lost it? Has so-and-so, cut off their balls? Has so-so, like, just gone to absolute shit? And then you listen to the review and it's like, oh, this is a great album. Or, oh, it's a pretty good album. Like, and it is purely to game the system of the negativity, to learn people going, what?
Yeah, that's the classic YouTube thumbnail thing as well, is the bold thing and then the picture of the reviewer doing the scream, like, or whatever. But yeah, it's just the way that the algorithm works in that sense. And I guess this kind of does lead us on to like, does it have any real impact? I guess I'm asking you as fans of metal now, like, will a particular review change the way you perceive an album, or is it just useful information that you take on board and might engage with? Does it really affect like your opinion on the music itself to some extent?
One of my favorite albums from last year got a pretty negative write-up in Decibel. Some other dude did not like it, doesn't like the band, didn't like the record, has no bearing on my opinion of the album, having listened to it multiple times since reading the review. I'm still as engaged with that music in a positive way. So I'm not sure that has much impact on me. I would also say that I've always been surprised when you talk about how much impact criticism can have on the scene. I've always been maybe a little disappointed when I go to something like Maryland Death Fest and I'm hanging around the Decibel magazine table there, or go to one of Decibel magazine's events. And the number of people who come by who have never picked up a magazine, who have never read Decibel magazine or didn't even know it existed, they just came out to the show. It all just feels like, no, we're not making a whole lot of impact on the scene in general.
And I guess to that question, because we kind of discussed it earlier on in terms of we can find reviews on albums we like engaging in terms of illuminating a different perspective on it. But yeah, if you like the album, you like the album. But I guess there is to that point, Dan, there's a huge chunk of the metal community that isn't really reading reviews. They're just maybe picking up albums from different sources online or whatever, but they're not interested in reading sort of writing about music in any sort of in-depth way in the kind of what we're discussing here, which I guess leads on to the fact that the music criticism itself, the ones that's affecting the most is the bands and the labels themselves, because they're the ones that are probably reading the reviews more closely than anyone else, because they want to know how it's been received in the scene.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I would argue that long term, so that's more of a short term perspective. I would argue that in the long term, criticism absolutely has an effect overall. I mean, there are lots of albums where the critical consensus has kind of ossified, calcified, and become this thing that everybody agrees that, whether it's Swan Song by Carcass or Cold Lake. So these are records that, like, people who haven't heard them understand what the critical consensus is already.
Yeah, and then sometimes you'll see someone who's trying to stand out by bucking that trend and saying, "Oh no, Cold Lake is good, and here's why." Like,
right?
That
and
is
then
true,
they instantly get banned by Tom G. War.
No, it's true, because I realized a few years ago I'd never listened to Saint Anger all the way through. I'd only heard the singles, and then I was like, let's just try it, because I am just letting other people color my perception of that album. And I was like, 20 minutes in, I was like, I can't do it anymore. I can't keep going. But anyway.
So, on that point, like the actual impact, like I was contemplating, I don't think certainly a negative review has ever changed my opinion, where like if I heard the music and thought, oh, I really enjoy this, I don't think there's ever been anything anyone could really say other than maybe make me not admit that I liked it, but which is more of a social pressure thing and might get more into the political stuff. But yeah, there's nothing that a review has done that has made me go, I suddenly don't like this anymore. Whereas I think I could probably pick out a few instances where with film and television that has happened. Like I watched something and thought, oh, I enjoy that. And then a review made me realize, oh, you know what? That movie really was shallow and kind of one-dimensional, and maybe I just enjoyed it on kind of a popcorn level. And now I think less of it. Or weirdly, I know this happened with a very specific television show, like miniseries on Netflix, where before I'd even seen it or watched a trailer, I was presented with a very, very negative review. But the reviewer, in terms of the examples and context they were giving, I know was so fundamentally wrong, like didn't understand the history, didn't understand the art they were referencing, that I was committed to see the show now to prove that this asshole didn't know what they were talking about.
I guess that comes back to what qualities the critic needs to have in terms of knowledge of what they're criticizing, or at least if they don't have any knowledge of what they're criticizing, make that quite explicit and sort of review it in those terms, to say, like, I'm reviewing this as someone who doesn't really know the context or history behind this, so it, my opinion might have limited value, but it could still be entertaining writing. Whereas with a review that's going to be useful, quote unquote, the critic does need to have some degree of expertise in the field. Cool. So I'm going to go off your last point here, Belisario. How to deal with hate. Has anyone ever had any negative responses to music criticism? I know I have, but...
Me too.
So I'd love to hear about that. How when you get those reactions, how do you process it?
Usually a fuck off.
It's fun to have this reaction, I think. Because in a way you expect it when you write something very negative.
Yeah, for me it's not fuck off. I'm normally, sympathetic to say, like, look, sorry, I understand this is probably quite upsetting or whatever because you've spent a lot of time on whatever the thing is. But my opinion is my opinion. And if you put something out there, for instance, I had a band, I posted a review on Hate Meditations, but most of the reviews on there I also post on Metal Archives. And I don't think the rating was that negative. It was, to your point, Dan, I think I gave it a 60%, which is, not an entirely terrible rating. But yeah, they were messaging me demanding that I change the percentage and so on. And I basically did the whole, look, yeah, I'm sorry, but this is my opinion. I'm not changing it, blah, blah, blah. But I also said, look, if you're releasing art into the public sphere, it's no longer up to you how it's received. Like, that's just the risk you take in putting art out there, is it won't be received with unconditional, like, love and support. There's a lot of different people out there with a lot of different opinions, and not everyone's going to like what you're doing. And part of the process of being an artist is learning to live with that in some way. I think that's kind of what my usual response is anyway.
In my case, it was with a big name. I remember some years ago I wrote a review about Immolation's Atonement, which I didn't like at all. But I wasn't so rude, I guess. I just said what was on my mind, and there were some people in the forum writing to me saying that I had no idea about music, that it was a great album and a great band. And in a way, I think it's a healthy thing to be critical sometimes, because you make people discuss about things, why they like it, and make them try to defend their point, which they not always can, because many music discussions end up resembling the comments on a YouTube video where everyone agrees that everything is great, and sometimes you get the need to disrupt this and not insulting the people that write these kind of comments, but just saying that there are things much better, or that this is very limited and they could be better done. And Yeah, it's a bit, it's fun, and in a way it's a bit kind of a militant action. Like you not only write about the things you like, but you also point out the things you think are not so good, as a kind of coherent way of saying that you estimate some things are better than others and should be taken so by more people, so to speak. And that's the way I say it.
It's interesting to hear you say that. I also was not a big fan of the Atonement record, and said so. Although I know somebody whose music tastes I absolutely trust, who's intimately knowledgeable of the band, who says Atonement is his favorite Immolation record. So it's just interesting to me that knowledgeable people can have such varying opinions. Yeah, I've had a situation similar when you talk about a record by Immolation. One thing I wrote was about, I think it's A Skeletal Domain by Cannibal Corpse, and I basically said, yeah, this is a new Cannibal Corpse record. Cannibal Corpse is great. You should listen to Cannibal Corpse, but this is just another Cannibal Corpse record. I wasn't over the top excited about it. And yeah, there were a lot of negative comments about how I didn't understand music and how Cannibal Corpse was over my head.
It's too sophisticated.
Of all bands.
Yeah, exactly. But I would say something that really disappointed me, kind of bummed me out a lot, was some years ago. I wrote what I thought was a fairly positive review of a new album. I put a 7 out of 10 score on it, and the writing itself was positive. But one of the band members, who I have a ton of respect for, and because I have respect for this person, of course would love to kind of have that respect in return. But man, he was really, really extremely unhappy with me and the review, and was publicly clear that he thought I didn't know what I was talking about and shouldn't be allowed to write about music. And yeah, it just bummed me
Dan,
out.
do you think if that no word in your review had been changed, not a single word, but that number had shifted from a 7 out of 10 to an 8 out of 10, he would have complained at all?
Actually, unfortunately, my answer is probably yes, because I think I made some comparisons of that music to some things that he did not think it related to at all. And he was just frustrated that I would make these comparisons, thereby showing that I'm a moron.
It's interesting from an optics point of view, because I've written reviews of like larger bands, and then the comments have blown up with fans going out to bat for the band. And again, I've always been suspicious of that, because it feels like people, it's not only criticizing one's own music that is upsetting, which I can completely understand, but if people are criticizing a band that you love, feeling the need to go out and police other people's opinions online, I find very confusing. If someone writes a negative review of an album I like, sort of going out to try and bully them essentially to change their view, it's just quite confusing behavior to me. But also, if you're a band who does receive, I mean, as you said in your case, Dan, not even a negative review, just a review that they might have found distasteful for whatever reason, it doesn't look good to publicly denounce it or like attack it. It does look quite petty. I have a friend that works for quite a large record label in London. He works in their PR department, and he's always dealing with bands' behavior, like their public image, basically, and their sort of policy on press coverage, right down to micro bloggers to larger magazines, is always, you just have to let it be. If you receive a negative review, don't go out publicly and attack that person, because it, just from an optics point of view, it makes you look bad, and it will attract more negative attention to whatever it is you're doing. It just it doesn't make sense from a kind of strategic point of view, for want of a better word.
I've definitely been on that end of it where, like, whether YouTube or somewhere made a comment about not enjoying some music, and the band or the musician themselves responded with "fuck you, buddy." I was like, okay.
Well, and I would offer, I have had almost a scarier, not scarier, but you'll see what I mean in a second, response when I wrote a review, and it was middling. Again, it was like a 5 or a 6 out of 10. It was, you know, there's a lot here that I want to like, but I felt like the music was a little bit aimless. It didn't end up taking me anywhere. And, I said all this. Well, when it was published, the artist contacted me and asked me, like, I understand you didn't really like this. What could I be doing differently? What would you prefer to be hearing? And I freaked out. And I told him, I wrote back, I was like, no, man, like, you have got to do your art on your terms. Do not pay attention to me. I want to hear, at all times, I want to hear what you want to create. Maybe it's not to my liking. That shouldn't matter. You've got to do your own thing.
Yeah, and I guess that really speaks to, again, the purpose of criticism is that we're not the arbiters of what's good and what's bad, and like we're not here to dole out advice. Like I've had people send me demos and asking for feedback and stuff, and I'm happy to do it, but I've always said, like, this needs to be your thing. I'll give my opinion, but please bear in mind it's my opinion. So I totally agree with that. And again, it's like, if you really do care about your sanity as an artist, you should probably ignore all criticism in general, actually, because we're ultimately writing for the listeners or people that want to read interesting opinions on music. We're not trying to be the arbiters of good taste in that sense. I did just want to touch on the small p political aspect to it, in that if you are a smaller platform, online platform, for instance, trying to gain more traction, writing a lot of positive reviews is more likely to get your page shared around by labels and bands and sort of increase engagement with your site. And I understand if you can't really speak on this from a Decibel point of view, but does it ever create tension with labels or whatever when you're giving negative coverage of a band and they're like, well, I'm not going to send you promos anymore, or there's not the tit for tat anymore? It feels like sometimes there's a bit of an unwritten social contract between the two parties where we give positive coverage in exchange for exclusive access to the music, or for additional engagement or whatever. Whereas if I was writing constant negative reviews, then just no one would share my page and no one would read what I'm doing. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say from the Decibel perspective, I'm buffered from that. I am assigned things to write by my editors. I submit things to those editors, and they have always published it. I guess my point is they always have the choice to not publish what I write. In fact, there have been a couple times when I've written negative things, and in my email back to them, I've said, look, if this is a bad idea and we shouldn't publish this, that's fine with me, just don't. But they always have. I'm sure it's possible that there is some frustration and maybe some problems between the labels and the magazine with advertising, things like that. I just have no interaction with that.
Yeah.
there's another level of the administration that handles all those things and really frees up the writers to say what we wish.
I mean, that's good in a way in terms of protecting the integrity of the writing, I suppose.
Yeah, I hope so.
Cool. Okay. Any other thoughts on anything we've discussed before we wrap up? Is there anything we've not covered that you wanted to cover off? That sounds like a resounding no.
I feel like we've really dug into this, so yeah.
We have, yeah.
Maybe we didn't talk so much about the impact of what we're doing, like what you were saying before, that many people don't need reviews or don't need magazines or anything. And I guess that what we do in a small or bigger scale is directed toward people that are actively searching for this. Like they don't come across your stuff accidentally. I think they're actively looking for opinions and maybe some advice or just information, and this is the kind of people you write to. And I usually have that in mind. Like, you're not writing to a general public, you're writing to people that are already interested, that have quite a proficient knowledge in general, and it's not the whole of the metalhead world. It's just a tiny fraction of people that are willing to read.
Well, yeah, as Dan said, even with Decibel, probably one of the biggest publications still going. There's still a huge chunk of the metal population that doesn't really read that magazine. And obviously, yeah, with our platforms, it's way smaller. I think, from my perspective as well, people are coming there for maybe a number of reasons. One is, yeah, they're just looking for stuff to listen to from maybe someone whose opinion they respect, because they need someone to filter through the mountains of stuff that's released each week, or they want to read what is hopefully entertaining and snappy writing. It isn't always, but on music. And yeah, what was the other thing I was going to say? It's that kind of, it comes back to that Anthony Fantano point in terms of, I could do a much broader kind of coverage of much more popular metal in a really accessible way, and hope that would draw in a bigger audience for people who aren't necessarily into metal at all. But I would find that less entertaining to some extent. I enjoy covering the really underground, like what I think of as cutting edge, kind of the vanguard of underground metal, because that's the stuff that I enjoy writing about. And I do that knowing that that's going to immediately limit my audience, because it's not only quite obscure music, but it's quite obscure verbose opinions on that music. So it's kind of cut down the potential audience to a very small demographic. But I do that because it is something I do in my spare time. I'm not paid for it or anything. So I guess that's kind of where I see it sitting to some extent.
I agree with that.
Yeah, no, I've always seen our sites as kind of nicely complementary in a way. And yeah, obviously with yours being in Spanish, I have to sort of translate it. But yeah, it's always interesting because we do cover some of the same stuff, and it's just interesting getting a different perspective on it. So yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, I'm glad I managed to have the stamina to get through that. And thank you very much for all your contributions. I think we've done the subject justice, although I'm sure there's still more to unpack, maybe with a different set of guests as well, some different opinions and things. But yeah, thank you very much for joining today. It's been a great chat.
Thank you, Shelley and Joe and Belisario. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Belisario. Thank you, Shelley.
Thank you. That was great.
Awesome. And thank you very much for listening, if you're still with us. Bit of a niche topic today, but hopefully you found something interesting in it. And enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.